The sun was dipping low over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the cracked pavement of the Salty Anchor diner. It was one of those small, coastal joints where the air always smelled like a mix of fried grease, old coffee, and the salty breeze blowing in from the Atlantic. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the hum of a ceiling fan that had been wobbling since the 90s and the low murmur of a few locals finishing their early dinners. In the far corner booth, 5 men sat huddled together. To anyone else, they looked like a group of hikers or construction workers on a break, but there was something different about the way they held themselves. They sat with their backs to the wall, their eyes constantly scanning the door, and their shoulders broad enough to make the vinyl booth look like dollhouse furniture. These were men who had seen things most people only watched in movies. They were Navy SEALs, recently back on home soil, trying to remember how to be regular people again. The youngest of the group, a man the others called Rooster, was currently mid-story, his hands moving wildly as he described a botched training exercise. The other 4 the veterans of the group chuckled, though their laughs didn't quite reach their eyes. They were in that strange limbo phase of a homecoming where the silence of a diner feels louder than the roar of a transport plane. They were loud, perhaps a bit too loud, their boisterous energy acting as a shield against the heavy memories waiting for them once they went home to their empty apartments. "I'm telling you," Rooster laughed, leaning back, "if the commander hadn't looked left at that exact second, I'd still be scrubbing floors in Virginia." It was a miracle, pure and simple. The man sitting across from him, the team's veteran medic, nodded slowly. He was nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 10 minutes ago. His eyes, sharp and observant, drifted away from his teammates for a moment and landed on the booth directly adjacent to theirs. A small girl, probably no older than 6, was sitting there. She had messy pigtails and was busily coloring a paper placemat with a blunt blue crayon. She seemed completely unfazed by the 5 hulking men sitting inches away. Sitting across from her was a woman, presumably her mother, dressed in a simple, sleeveless denim sundress. She was focused on her phone, a tired but peaceful expression on her face. The medic's gaze lingered for a second on the woman's right shoulder. There was a tattoo there. It wasn't the kind of flashy, colorful art you usually see at a beach town. It was small, stark, and looked almost like a series of coordinates or a serial number, followed by a tiny, hand-drawn star. It looked out of place on her, like a jagged piece of metal in a garden. The little girl suddenly dropped her crayon. It rolled across the floor and bumped right into Rooster's dusty boot. The diner went a little quieter as Rooster looked down. He reached down with a hand that was covered in small scars and calluses, picked up the blue crayon, and held it out. "I think you dropped your ammunition, kid," Rooster said, his voice dropping an octave into a gentle, playful tone. The girl giggled, reaching out to take it. "Thank you, Mr. Soldier Man." The woman looked up then, her eyes widening slightly as she realized her daughter was talking to the group. She offered a quick, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, she doesn't know the meaning of personal space yet." "No trouble at all," the team leader, a man with graying hair at his temples, replied. "We're used to noise. It's the quiet that bothers us." The woman nodded, a flicker of understanding passing through her eyes, the kind of look shared between people who have known high-stress lives. She went back to her menu, but the little girl wasn't done. She stood up on the vinyl seat, leaning over the back of the booth to get a better look at the 5 men. "My mom is strong like you guys," the girl whispered loudly, the way children do when they think they're being secretive. Rooster grinned. "Is she now? Does she do 100 push-ups a morning?" "No," the girl said, shaking her head so hard her pigtails flopped. "But she survived the big sand, and she has a secret map on her arm so she never gets lost again." The mother reached back, gently patting the girl's hand to get her to sit down. Hush now. Let the gentlemen eat their dinner in peace. But the word sand had caught the attention of all 5 men. In their world, the sand only meant one thing: the Middle East. They looked at the woman again, really looking at her this time. She didn't look like a soldier. She looked like a teacher or a nurse or someone you'd pass in the grocery store without a second thought. The medic, whose eyes hadn't left that tattoo, cleared his throat. The playful atmosphere in the booth evaporated instantly. His teammates noticed the change in him. When the medic got serious, the world stopped spinning. He leaned slightly toward the woman, his voice respectful but strained. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't mean to pry, truly. But that ink on your shoulder." I couldn't help but notice the format. The woman paused. She slowly put her menu down on the table. The tired look in her eyes sharpened into something much deeper, something guarded. She instinctively moved her hand to cover the tattoo, but then she stopped herself. She let her hand drop. "It's a date and a location," she said softly. "Most people think it's just a birth date or a lucky number." The medic shook his head slowly. He looked at his teammates, and one by one, their eyes moved to the woman's shoulder. They weren't looking at the tattoo as art anymore. They were reading it like a mission brief. The lead navigator of the team, a man who had spent the last decade staring at topographical maps and GPS coordinates, felt a chill run down his spine. He recognized the string of numbers. He didn't just recognize them, he had them memorized. They were etched into his brain in the same way they were etched into her skin. "Those aren't just coordinates," the navigator whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "That's a specific grid in the red zone, near the border." The other 4 SEALs went rigid. The boisterous energy from moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The sounds of the diner, the clinking of silverware, the hum of the fan, the distant sound of the waves seemed to fade into the background. The little girl, sensing the shift in the adults, looked from the men to her mother. She pointed again at the tiny star at the end of the numbers. "My mom got that drawing because of the man who saved her life in the desert," she said, her voice clear and innocent in the quiet room. "He told her to keep going and never look back." The lead navigator felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that star. He knew exactly who used to draw that specific 5-pointed star on the back of his gloves, on his locker, and on the bottom of every letter he sent home to his own family. The 5 most dangerous men in the room sat in total silence, their eyes fixed on a small tattoo on a stranger's shoulder, as the weight of a ghost from their past suddenly filled the booth. The silence at the table was different now. It wasn't the comfortable silence of friends or the exhausted silence of a long day. It was the kind of heavy, ringing quiet that happens right after a lightning strike. The 5 men sat perfectly still, their eyes locked on the woman's shoulder as if they were looking at a ghost. The lead navigator, a man the team called Chief, felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He had spent years training himself to stay calm under fire, to keep his cool when everything was falling apart. But this was different. This was a piece of his past, sitting in a booth at a random diner, next to a plate of half-eaten fries. He looked at the woman. She wasn't looking at her phone anymore. She was watching them, her expression a mix of caution and a sudden, sharp realization. She saw the way their faces had changed. She saw the way the medic's hand was trembling just a tiny bit as he held his coffee cup. She knew they weren't just curious travelers. They were men who knew exactly what those numbers meant. "That star," Chief said, his voice barely a whisper. "The way the bottom left point is just a little bit longer than the others. I haven't seen that in a long time." The woman took a deep breath. She reached over and moved a stray hair away from her daughter's face, but her eyes never left Chief's. "He used to draw it on the walls of the cellar where they kept me," she said quietly. "Every time he brought me water or told me to keep my head down, he'd leave that mark near the door. He told me it was a North Star. He said as long as I could see it, I wasn't lost." Rooster, the youngest of the group, felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't been on that mission, he was still in training back then. But he had heard the stories. Every new guy on the team heard the stories about the man who stayed behind. They called him the captain, though that wasn't his rank. It was just a title of respect. He was the kind of leader who didn't just give orders, he lived them. "We were told there were no survivors from that sector," the medic said, his voice thick with emotion. "The extraction team reported total loss of the target site after the airstrike. They said the building was gone." The woman shook her head slowly. "The building was gone. But we weren't in the building anymore. He got me out through a drainage tunnel 2 minutes before the first blast. He carried me for 3 miles through the sand because I couldn't walk. My feet they weren't in good shape." She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "He found a small crevice in the rocks. It was barely big enough for one person, let alone 2. He shoved me inside and told me to stay quiet, no matter what I heard. He gave me his canteen and his flashlight. And then he told me he had to go back to draw the fire away from my position, or the drones wouldn't be able to pick me up safely." The 5 SEALs listened, leaning in so close they were almost falling out of their seats. They had lived this story from the other side. They remembered the radio chatter. They remembered the panicked calls for backup that never arrived in time. They remembered the smoke on the horizon and the feeling of failure that had followed them home like a shadow. "He told me his name was just Jack," she continued. "He wouldn't tell me a last name. He said names didn't matter in the sand. Only getting home mattered. He told me he had a daughter about my age back home, and he wanted me to promise that if I made it out, I'd live a life big enough for both of us." At the mention of the name Jack, the man sitting at the end of the booth, a rugged, quiet guy they called Bear, put his face in his hands. He didn't sob, but his shoulders shook. Jack had been his best friend. They had gone through the grueling selection process together. They had shared 1,000 meals just like this one. The little girl, seeing Bear's distress, climbed out of her seat. She walked over to the end of the table and tugged on his sleeve. When he looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, she handed him a small plastic toy soldier from her pocket. "Don't be sad," she said with the simple, crushing honesty of a child. "My mom says heroes never really leave. They just turn into stars so they can watch us from the top." The woman wiped a tear from her cheek. "I'm a doctor now," she said to the men. "I went back to school the year I got home. I work in the emergency room at the city hospital. I spent a long time wondering if I was worth the price he paid. I look at that tattoo every morning in the mirror to remind myself that I have to be. I have to be worth it." The chief looked at his teammates. The anger they had been carrying, the bitterness about that mission, the feeling that their brother had died for nothing started to lift. It was replaced by something else. They were looking at a woman who had saved hundreds of lives in an ER because one man had decided her life was worth more than his own. They were looking at a little girl who existed because of a choice made in the middle of a desert thousands of miles away. "You're the doctor from the relief convoy," the medic realized, his voice filled with awe. "We spent 3 days searching for you before the trail went cold. We thought we had failed him." "You didn't fail," the woman said firmly. "He did exactly what he set out to do. He brought me home." The diner was still humming along. A waitress walked by with a tray of burgers. The bell on the door jingled as a local fisherman walked in, and the smell of coffee remained unchanged. But for the 6 people in those 2 booths, the world had been completely rearranged. The Salty Anchor was no longer just a place to grab a cheap meal. It had become a chapel of sorts, a place where a debt was finally acknowledged. Chief reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, bronze coin. It had the team's insignia on one side and a series of values engraved on the other: loyalty, honor, sacrifice. He laid it on the table between them. "We've been carrying the weight of that day for 8 years," Chief said. "We thought we left Jack in the sand. But seeing you, seeing her, it feels like we finally brought him home, too." The woman looked at the coin, then at the 5 men, who looked like they had just had a mountain lifted off their backs. She reached out and took the chief's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "He talked about you guys," she whispered. "In the dark, when he was trying to keep me from being afraid, he told me stories about his brothers. He told me he wasn't afraid to go back out there because he knew he was part of something bigger than himself." As she spoke, the sun finally disappeared below the ocean line, and the first few stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky outside the diner window. The woman noticed the heavy bronze coin sitting on the table, and for the first time, she truly let her guard down. She pulled her chair a little closer to the men's booth. The diner's evening rush was starting to fade, leaving them in a small bubble of shared history. The little girl had gone back to her coloring, but she was listening, her blue crayon moving rhythmically across the paper. "He had a nickname for the team," the woman said, a small smile playing on her lips as she looked at the 5 men. "He didn't use your real names, of course. He called you his 5 fingers. He said that alone, a finger can be broken, but together, you made a fist that nothing could get through. He told me that if I ever met a group of men who looked like they could knock down a mountain but treated each other like brothers, I'd know I found his people." Bear, the big man who had been Jack's closest friend, let out a shaky breath that was half laugh and half soapy. "That sounds like him. Always talking in metaphors. He used to drive us crazy with that stuff during long night watches. We'd be sitting in the mud, freezing our tails off, and he'd start talking about the philosophy of teamwork." The woman laughed softly. "He told me about the time one of you, he called him, the Birdman, tried to cook a gourmet meal over a portable stove in the middle of a jungle and ended up setting a bush on fire." All eyes turned to Rooster, who turned a bright shade of red. "It was supposed to be a surprise," he muttered, though a genuine smile finally broke across his face. "I just wanted something that didn't taste like plastic for once. I didn't know the leaves were that flammable." The tension that had gripped the table since they arrived began to melt away. It was a strange, beautiful thing to watch. These men, who usually only spoke about the technical details of their jobs or used dark humor to cope with their stress, were suddenly talking about the man they had lost as if he were standing right there with them. They weren't talking about the soldier, they were talking about the person. "He saved more than just me that day," the woman said, her voice turning serious again. She looked down at her daughter. "When I got back, I was broken. Not just physically, but in my head. I had nightmares every time I closed my eyes. I didn't think I could ever go back to being a doctor. I thought the world was just a dark, violent place." She took a sip of her water, her hand steady now, but then I remembered the way he talked about his family. He told me he had a daughter who was just starting to learn how to ride a bike. He told me he had recorded a video of himself reading her favorite bedtime story so she could hear his voice while he was gone. He was so proud of her. He said that the reason he did what he did wasn't because he hated what was in front of him, but because he loved what he left behind. Chief leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "He never got to see her ride that bike," he said quietly. "We went to the funeral, of course. We saw his wife and the little girl. But we were so wrapped up in our own guilt that we couldn't even look them in the eye. We felt like we had failed his family. We thought that by losing him, his whole legacy just stopped. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It was a picture of her on her graduation day from medical school. She was wearing her white coat, and she was holding a newborn baby, the little girl sitting next to her. But if you looked closely at the frame, she had tucked a small piece of fabric behind the glass. It was a tattered piece of tan webbing from a tactical vest. "I found this in my pocket when I was in the hospital after the rescue," she explained. "He must have tucked it in there when he shoved me into that rock crevice. It was his name tape, but the name had been rubbed off by the sand. All that was left was that little hand-drawn star." She turned the photo around so the men could see. "I named her after the star," she whispered. "Her middle name is Stella. It means star in Latin. I wanted her to grow up knowing that she exists because a man she never met decided that a stranger's life was worth more than his own. I wanted her to have a piece of him with her, always." The medic reached out and touched the edge of the photo. He would have loved that. Jack was a man of science, too, in his own way. He used to say that we're all just made of stardust, and when we die, we just go back to the sky to guide the people we love. The little girl, hearing her name, looked up. "Mommy says my starman is a hero," she said proudly. "She says he has the biggest house in the sky because he saved a lady who saves other people." The impact of those words hit the five SEALs like a physical blow. They had spent years looking at Jack's death as a tragedy, a dark spot on their record and a hole in their lives. But sitting here, looking at this doctor and her vibrant, happy daughter, they realized they were looking at the big life Jack had told her to live. His sacrifice wasn't a dead end. It was a bridge. "You know," Bear said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, "we came into this diner today feeling pretty low. We just finished a rough stretch. We were feeling like the world was getting a little too heavy to carry. But I think Jack knew we were coming here. I think he wanted us to see this." Chief nodded. He always did have the best timing. He knew exactly when the team needed a reminder of why we do what we do. The woman looked around the table at the five faces, some young and eager, some old and scarred. She saw the relief in their eyes, and she felt a sense of closure she didn't know she was missing. For years, she had carried the weight of being the one who lived. Now, she realized she wasn't carrying it alone. She had 5 brothers. She hadn't known she had. "I have something else to show you," the woman said, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "It's the reason we're actually in this town today. It isn't just a random stop." The men leaned in, their curiosity piqued. The story was shifting from the past into the present, and they could feel that something even more significant was about to be revealed. "I didn't just get the tattoo to remember the location," she said. "I used the coordinates to find someone." The 5 men sat in a trance, leaning so far over the table that their chests were almost touching the edge. The woman's voice had changed. It wasn't just the voice of someone telling a sad story anymore. It was the voice of someone on a mission. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It looked like a printed map with several handwritten notes scrawled in the margins. "After I got my degree," she began, her eyes moving between Chief and Bear, "I started looking. I had the coordinates from the tattoo, but I knew those were just the place where my life almost ended. I wanted to find the place where Jack's life began. I wanted to find his home." Bear's breath hitched. His family moved after the funeral. The house they lived in, his wife couldn't stay there. It was too quiet. We lost track of them a few years back. We sent letters, but they came back returned to sender. We thought they wanted to be left alone. The woman nodded understandingly. "Grief does that. It makes you want to hide. But I didn't give up. Being a doctor makes you good at research. I used the badge number that Jack had carved into the wall of that cellar, the one that's part of my tattoo. I tracked down the pension records. It took me 3 years of digging through public files and making phone calls. She pointed to a spot on the map, a small town just 20 miles up the coast from where they were sitting right now. They live in a small cottage near the lighthouse, his wife and the daughter he talked about, the one who is a teenager now. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was a silence filled with a strange, nervous electricity. The seals looked at each other. For years they had lived with the ghost of their friend, but the idea of facing his living, breathing family felt terrifying. It was one thing to fight a battle. It was another thing to look a widow in the eye and tell her you survived while her husband didn't. "We're on our way to see them," the woman said. "Today is the anniversary. Not the anniversary of the day he stayed behind, but the anniversary of the day I was officially cleared to go home. I visit them every year on this day. We call it Jack's Day." Rooster looked at the woman with a new kind of respect. "You stayed in touch with them all this time? They are the only people in the world who truly understand why I wake up and do what I do," she replied. "And his daughter, she needs to know that her father wasn't just a photo on a mantelpiece. She needs to hear about the man who made jokes about 5 fingers and burnt bushes in the jungle." Chief rubbed his face with his hands. He looked at the heavy bronze coin still sitting on the table. "We should have been there. We should have been there once telling her those stories. We were so ashamed." "Don't be," the woman said firmly, reaching across to touch Chief's arm. "Jack wouldn't want your shame. He'd want your stories. He'd want you to sit at their table and tell his daughter about the time he saved your skins. He'd want her to know she has 5 uncles who would move the earth for her." The little girl, Stella, suddenly looked up from her coloring. She had finished her masterpiece. She slid the paper across to the medic. It was a drawing of a big, yellow sun and 5 stick-figure men standing in a row. Above them, she had drawn a single, bright star with a long bottom point. "You're the fingers," she said, pointing to the stick figures. "And the star is the thumb that holds you together." The medic looked at the drawing, and a single tear finally escaped, tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "I'm keeping this, kiddo. It's the best piece of intelligence I've received in a decade." The woman stood up, signaling to the waitress for the check. "We have to get going if we want to make it to the lighthouse before sunset. We always watch the sun go down together. It's a tradition." She looked at the 5 men, her expression inviting. "It's a 20-minute drive. I think there's a girl up the road who would very much like to hear about the Birdman and his cooking skills. And I know her mother would love to see the men Jack loved so much." The seals didn't even need to discuss it. They rose as one, their chairs scraping against the floor in unison. The heavy, dark cloud that had been hanging over them since they walked into the diner was gone. For the first time in 8 years, they weren't looking back at a grave in the sand. They were looking forward at a road that led to a home. As they walked toward the door, the diner seemed brighter. The waitress smiled as they left a tip that was probably more than she made in a week. The bell above the door gave a cheerful chime as they stepped out into the cool evening air. The parking lot was quiet, the sound of the ocean louder now that they were outside. The woman led the way to her SUV, and the 5 men followed in their rugged truck. As they pulled out of the lot, the woman looked in her rearview mirror. She saw the headlights of the men's truck behind her, steady and strong. She felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had spent years carrying a secret map on her skin, wondering if she would ever find the people who belonged to it. Now, as the convoy moved toward the lighthouse, she realized that the coordinates hadn't just saved her life. They were bringing an entire family back together. "Mommy?" Stella asked from the back seat, buckled into her car seat. "Yes, honey? Do you think the Starman is happy right now?" The woman looked at the truck behind them, filled with 5 men who were finally breathing again, and then she looked at the tattoo on her shoulder. "I think he's never been happier," she whispered. The drive to the lighthouse was short, but for the 5 men in the truck, it felt like the longest journey of their lives. They followed the taillights of the SUV through winding coastal roads where the trees leaned away from the salt spray. Nobody spoke. The usual jokes and the constant radio chatter had been replaced by a quiet, focused anticipation. They were heading toward a house they had visited 100 times in their minds, but never in person. When they finally pulled into the graveled driveway of a small white cottage, the sun was just a sliver of red on the horizon. The lighthouse stood a few hundred yards away, its rhythmic beam of light already sweeping across the darkening water. The cottage was simple, with a porch swing and a garden filled with hardy seagrass. As the woman and little Stella hopped out of their car, the front door of the cottage creaked open. A woman stepped out onto the porch. She looked older than the last time the men had seen her, but she had the same steady, kind eyes. Behind her stood a teenage girl with a mop of curly hair, Jack's daughter. She was wearing an old, oversized military fleece that was clearly too big for her, but she wore it like a suit of armor. The widow froze when she saw the 2 vehicles. She recognized the woman and Stella immediately, but her eyes drifted to the 5 large men climbing out of the truck. Her hand went to her mouth, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the grass. "You brought them," the widow whispered, as the woman reached the porch steps. "They were waiting for you," the woman replied softly. "They just didn't know how to find their way back." Chief was the first to step forward. He removed his cap, holding it against his chest. He looked at the widow, then at the teenage girl who had her father's exact smile. "We're sorry it took us so long," he said, his voice thick and rough. "We got lost in the woods for a while." The widow didn't say a word. She simply walked down the steps and wrapped her arms around Chief in a crushing hug. One by one, she hugged each of them. Bear, Rooster, and the rest. It wasn't a greeting for strangers. It was a welcome home for brothers who had been gone far too long. The teenage girl, whom they remembered as a toddler, stepped forward shyly. "You're the 5 fingers," she said, looking at them with wide eyes. "My dad wrote about you in his journals. He said Bear was the one who could sleep through a hurricane, and Rooster was the one who couldn't boil water without an instruction manual." A roar of laughter broke the tension. Bear wiped his eyes and grinned. "Guilty as charged, kiddo. And I can still sleep through anything, though your dad used to throw boots at me to wake me up." The group moved toward the edge of the cliff near the lighthouse, where a small stone bench sat overlooking the Atlantic. This was the spot. The widow sat in the center, with the woman who had the tattoo on one side, and Jack's daughter on the other. The 5 seals stood behind them like a human wall, protective and solid. The woman in the denim dress turned so her shoulder was visible in the fading light. "I told them about the coordinates," she said to the widow. "I told them how Jack used to draw the star to keep me brave." The teenage girl reached out and touched the tattoo on the woman's arm. "I have one too," she said quietly. She pulled back the sleeve of her fleece to reveal a small, temporary ink drawing she had made on her own wrist, the same 5-pointed star with the long bottom leg. "I draw it every morning before school. It makes me feel like he's walking me to class." Rooster reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a silver whistle Jack had used during training drills years ago. "I've been carrying this since the day we got back," Rooster said, handing it to the girl. "I didn't think I had the right to keep it anymore. I think it belongs with the person who has the star." The girl took the whistle, her fingers trembling slightly. She blew into it, a short, sharp blast that echoed against the sound of the crashing waves. It was a sound of life, a sound of defiance against the silence of loss. As the last of the sun disappeared, the woman with the tattoo looked at the men. I spent a long time wondering why I was the one who got to come home. I felt like I was carrying a debt I could never pay back. But sitting here tonight, seeing all of you together, I realized the debt isn't about the past, it's about the future. She looked at Stella, who was now sitting in Bear's lap, listening to a story about a magic helicopter. She looked at Jack's daughter, who was laughing for the first time in a long time, as the medic told her about her father's terrible singing voice. The meaning of the tattoo isn't just a location, the woman said. It's a promise. It's a promise that no matter how far we wander or how dark the desert gets, we aren't alone as long as we remember each other. The widow stood up and looked at the 5 men. There's a big pot of chili on the stove inside, she said with a small, knowing smile. And I think we have about 8 years' worth of stories to catch up on. Are you hungry? Chief looked at his team. The shadows under their eyes seemed lighter. The weight in their chests had finally settled into something manageable, something like peace. We're starving, Chief said. As they walked back toward the warm yellow light of the cottage, the lighthouse beam swept over them, illuminating the group for a brief second. In that flash of light, you couldn't tell who was a soldier, who was a survivor, or who was a grieving child. They were just a family, stitched together by a sacrifice in the small hand-drawn star. The 5 fingers were finally whole again. Not because their brother had returned, but because they had finally found the people he had loved the most. And as they stepped over the threshold of the house, the little girl Stella looked up at the sky. Look, Mommy, she whispered, pointing to a single bright star hanging directly over the lighthouse. He's watching the dinner party. The woman smiled, touched the tattoo on her shoulder one last time, and closed the door, leaving the darkness of the past outside in the cold Atlantic wind.